All right, welcome back. We are covering the High Middle Ages today, so wrapping up this week's lecture material before our quiz tomorrow. All right, so today we're calling it Crusaders and Scholars from 1000 to 1299. All right, so let's dig in. So, quick overview of the period here. We begin with what's called the Great Schism. So, Eastern and Western Christianity, you could also divide it along Latin-speaking versus Greek-speaking lines. They grow further and further apart, and there are three kinds of reasons for this. Okay, there are political reasons, cultural and linguistic reasons, and religious reasons. So, political and geographical reasons, of course, they're no longer part of the same empire. So, like we said, the Western Roman Empire has fallen, and there is no more Roman Empire over there. Whereas in the East, they're still governed by a formerly Roman, now a Byzantine empire or emperor. Okay. So it's still the remnants of the Roman Empire over there. Politically, now we've got Charlemagne and the Holy Roman emperors in the West. Okay. So there becomes a political rivalry there. Culturally, okay, there are cultural differences, but the biggest problem is that in the East, they speak Greek. In the West, they speak Latin, and there's not a whole lot of crossover. There are not a lot of Western people who know Greek well, and not a lot of Greeks who know Latin well. So it's hard to communicate, especially theologically, because they're getting into some really specific theological disputes. And so the Greek-Latin language barrier makes it really hard to agree on things or to understand where the other person or the other church or group of Christians is coming from. All right. So we'll dig into that a little bit, not too much though. The Crusades then, this is the period of Crusades. Basically, Western Europe is now responding to the spread of Islam and the attacks of the Muslim caliphates, and especially the Seljuk Turks, who are newcomers on the scene in the Middle East, responding to those attacks against Byzantium and assaulting and harassing Eastern Christians. All right, so these are military responses to that aggression by these Islamic empires. We'll talk a little bit more about those. Six more ecumenical councils, in fact. 4 Lateran councils, which are held in Rome at the Lateran Basilica, as I recall, and 2 in Lyon, which is in France. Okay, the most notable would be the 4th Lateran Council, which addressed the issue of transubstantiation and defined that the Eucharist, the bread and wine, becomes the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Christ. Many other things were addressed as well. But you also get what's called the lay investiture controversies. So lay investiture involves secular rulers like kings, emperors, princes, choosing people for bishop and then investing them with their authority within the church. Now, they still had bishops ordaining those bishops because only a bishop can pass on the sacred teaching, governing, and sanctifying power, spiritual authority, to another bishop. Okay, but the prince or the king or the emperor would then invest the bishop with their office, so to speak. And so this was an issue of church-state relations and which was the higher authority. Okay, so you get the popes and emperors and kings and princes butting heads over this issue because the pope thinks that the church is the higher authority and the secular rulers often want to put themselves above that. Okay, but you also get religious revivals and some rejuvenation, spiritual rejuvenation in Europe here. So some new reformed monastic orders. Okay, so up to this point, everything had basically been Benedictine in Western Europe. But some of those monasteries got kind of lax. They weren't really living out the evangelical counsels very intensely. They were becoming wealthy. All right, so you get some offshoots of that. Basically, these Cistercians are trying to return to the original observance of the rule of St. Benedict, and the Carthusian monks are trying to be more silent, more contemplative even than the Benedictines. Okay, we'll talk a bit more about those groups. Then you also get what are called the mendicant orders. Mendicant comes from this Latin term mendicare, to beg. So these are begging orders, okay? as opposed to a monastery where the monasteries are producing their own food and selling whatever they don't need in addition to that. Okay, they're fairly self-sustaining, self-sufficient. These new mendicant orders are not producing their own goods, but relying entirely on the goodwill and the donations and the support of other people, okay? Because they're not living in a monastery. They're actually out preaching and teaching and caring for the poor. So these are active orders, all right? The Franciscans and Dominicans are the big ones that we'll talk about, okay? Scholasticism develops. Okay, this follows on the development of the university. So universities pop up in Europe at this time as individual schools come together, and they come together as these unified places where you can come and you can study Latin, you can study rhetoric, you can study medicine, you can study theology and philosophy, all of these things in one kind of collection of schools. That's what the university is. And scholasticism is a method of doing philosophy and theology that comes up from these schools. Okay, it's a very distinctive approach to philosophy and theology. All right. And then finally, the Inquisition happens at this point in time. Now, the Inquisition has some bad things come out of it, but the idea behind it is to get rid of heresy in Europe, because Europe now is a unified Christian civilization, essentially. There are divisions within it, but what unites all of Europe is its Christian faith, and particularly its Catholic faith. So Thomas Aquinas, for example, compares heresy with murder. Murder kills the body, but heresy actually threatens to kill the soul. So false belief can lead you away from God and lead you to eternal damnation. That's the idea. So the Inquisition is actually there to, in essence, prevent spiritual murder. Okay, that's the idea behind it. Now, there's bad stuff that comes out of that, of course, and the Inquisition gets a very bad reputation, but at least we can understand the historical context. Okay, let's go ahead and answer question 1. Okay, map of the First Crusade. This happened in 1099. Okay, so you've got 4 different armies, the gold, the blue, the red, and the brown. Each represent a different army. They take different routes. They meet up in Constantinople, and then they essentially take a unified route through Nicaea there, Edessa, Antioch, down to Jerusalem. And they reconquer this whole strip in the Holy Land. The Crusader kingdom lasts really till about 1291. So almost 200 years you have a Latin Crusader kingdom in the Holy Land. Okay. All right, so major events in this time period. 1054 is the year where the Great Schism finally happens. Okay, Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy split off in what has basically become a permanent divide. There's hope for reunification eventually, but they've been divided. We've been divided from them for nearly 1,000 years. 1077, part of this lay investiture controversy, you get Pope St. Gregory VII now, ends up excommunicating Emperor Henry IV, who is the distant successor of Charlemagne as the Holy Roman Emperor. So Henry appointed his own bishop and invested him with his authority in defying the instructions of Pope Gregory VII. So Gregory excommunicates Henry. Henry ends up coming back on his knees in repentance and asking forgiveness. He gets pardoned, comes back into communion, and then goes back to his old antics. So this is just one example of a battle between the Pope and an emperor, basically over the issue of the authority of the church versus the authority of the state. Okay. A few years later, so 1084, St. Bruno establishes the Carthusians. Now, the Carthusians are the guys in white that we watched when we were talking about Lectio Divina, living at La Grande Chartreuse. Guigo, the guy that you read a couple of Fridays ago, Guigo was a Carthusian about 100 years or so after St. Bruno. Bruno wanted basically to establish a sort of community of hermits. So the Carthusians live in individual cells, but they come together for common times of prayer, more isolated basically than a normal monastery. Okay. Then 1096 is when the First Crusade is called by Blessed Pope Urban II. 1096 through 1272 marks the period of the Crusades, more or less. These are, again, military campaigns aimed at defending Christians in the Middle East who are being harassed by the Seljuk Turks. and reclaiming the Holy Land, which was lost when the Muslim invaders had basically taken it from the Byzantine Empire. Okay, and the Byzantine Empire was threatened, and Western Europeans knew that if Byzantium fell, especially if Constantinople fell, then Western Europe could very likely get overrun by these Turks. Okay, so more or less defensive wars here. Okay, certainly involved atrocities, but there were good intentions behind them. Okay, 1113, Saint Bernard of Clairvaux establishes. He's the co-founder, basically, of the Cistercian order. The Cistercians, again, are trying to return to the original way that the rule of Saint Benedict was meant to be lived out. Okay, so they're a little bit more strict than the ordinary Benedictines. All right, 1175, the University of Paris is founded. That's still here, so coming up on 900 years pretty soon. So that's remarkable, 850 years, I guess. But so the University of Paris is where St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Bonaventure, for example, taught. All right, so one of the great universities of the Middle Ages. So AD 1203, around there, then you get St. Dominic establishing the Dominican order. All right, he establishes this in Spain, preaching against the Albigensian heresy. All right, so ask our sisters about St. Dominic, if you will, but their order is over 800 years old, which is kind of amazing. And then 1209, so 6 years later, St. Francis of Assisi establishes the Franciscan order. These are both mendicant orders, okay, begging orders. They are out preaching and teaching and caring for the poor. All right, relying on the generosity of people of goodwill. Okay, so radical poverty, even much more poverty than a normal monastery, especially in the early days. Okay, all right. Do you want to answer question 2? All right, here is the oldest portrait that we have of St. Francis from about 1228 or 1229. So this is really right around his lifetime. So it probably is fairly accurate as far as it goes. Major people saints from this period. All right, so parties involved immediately responsible for the Great Schism. Michael Cerularius was the Patriarch of Constantinople, and then Cardinal Humbert was the Pope's representative in Constantinople at the time. These two got in a feud, and Cardinal Humbert excommunicated Michael Cerularius, Patriarch Cerularius, and then the Patriarch, in response, excommunicated Cardinal Humbert and the Pope. And here we are, still in schism. Okay. Pope St. Gregory VII, so he was a major force in fighting against lay investiture and promoting the authority of the Pope in general. So he is largely responsible for solidifying the power of the Pope during the Middle Ages, which was quite significant. All right, Blessed Pope Urban II, called the First Crusade, as I mentioned. Assisi, all religious founders or reformers, and then St. Clare of Assisi, I didn't mention her. She founded the Poor Clares. She basically was a follower and good friend of St. Francis. Then she established this sort of female, not equivalent order, but an order of cloistered nuns called the Poor Clares. All right. They're still around too. Then you get the great scholastic philosophers and theologians. So St. Anselm of Canterbury, Thomas Aquinas, Bonaventure. These are really the three big names of scholasticism. St. Hildegard of Bingen, or von Bingen. She was a remarkable scholar and scientist and mystic and composer of music. So her sacred music is some of the most well-known from the Middle Ages. Okay, she was an incredible woman, a Benedictine abbess. So she was the female, the mother, essentially, of a Benedictine convent in Germany. Okay. And then St. Thomas Becket was Archbishop of Canterbury, who ends up getting assassinated, martyred, really, in front of the altar because he refuses to go along with some of the King of England's efforts to control the church. So he ends up getting martyred. All right. Answer question 3. And when you're done with that, you know the drill. So pick one of those, give me a paragraph summary. All right, and we'll get ready for the quiz tomorrow. I'll post a short study guide. Thank you.